Hey everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Garage. This is the first video in my new home automation series. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about Ansible. I will be going back to that in and out in the near future. So this series is going to talk to you about what home automation is, how I use home automation, and ultimately by the end of this we'll have a few videos that will show you about the hardware, the middleware, and some of the software that you probably want to use. I'm going to keep this series open-ended, and you'll be able to see this with the tagged playlist of Home Assistant. And that kind of gives away a bit of what we're going to get onto here, just because I want to stay abreast of some of the developments and some of the things that, to be fair, what I use is a little bit outdated now, albeit most of the processes and most of the theory is still applicable. I want to try and get onto some of that newer stuff, both to keep abreast of what's going on, but also because I probably want to start upgrading some of my things anyway. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about what I've got set up, how it operates, some of the home automation, and then by the end of this video, we'll have set up Deconz by Phoscon. Don't worry if this all sounds alien. They will all become clear in this video. And that will give you a view of all of the devices in my home mesh network that use Zigbee. Again, don't worry about that. I'm going to talk about that shortly, and how that all integrates with Home Assistant. So let's have a quick recap of what home automation is. Then I'll talk about what I use, and then we'll get into the deployment. So what do we mean by home automation? Well, home automation is basically automating many of the things that you do manually within your home. It can be as simple as things like making sure lights turn on and off, or it can be more complex. So it can be things like humidity sensors, water irrigation systems, smart locks, cameras, all of those sorts of things. Plus you can add a ton of logic onto those things through Home Assistant and other applications, such as you want an event to happen when something else happens. So for example, one of the things I use is during the hours when it's not light, i.e. the sun's down, I want my motion sensors to turn on the lights in those rooms. Really handy for things like hallways, etc. Means I don't trip up in the dark, means that I don't have to go up in the dark first before I find the light switch, all those sorts of things. And also really handy for when the kids wake up in the middle of the night, want to go to the toilet, etc. So how does all this stuff cobble together? Well, I started out my journey using the Hue by Philips ecosystem, and I still have a load of their devices in my home network. I actually think they're probably the best, albeit they're astronomically expensive now, and there's strong competition from other parties that basically have the same, if not better, functionality these days. Now, all of this stuff predominantly, other than your smart devices, so I'm talking about things like TVs, audio receivers, games consoles, and probably a myriad of other things, fridges, toasters, that's kind of the era we're in now. Most of these things, well, they operate over a network. Most of these things will operate wirelessly. More on this sort of Internet of Things side, so the smaller, cheaper devices, things like this, which is a mobile light switch, they operate on a mesh network. So that uses the Zigbee protocol, which by its nature is mesh. So I'll show you a demonstration of that later in the video. But effectively what that means is devices are able to mesh together, to connect to one another, to relay signals back to a controller. That's different from your traditional IP-based network, whereby you will have a router and all of your devices will have a one-to-one kind of hub and spoke relationship with that router. So all traffic will go one way to the router and back. In this setup, we might have this smart switch attached to this smart light up here, and then it goes back to the controller. So that introduces quite nicely the controller. So when I used to have my Hue set up, it used what was called the Hue bridge. Now that's kind of a commonly used term, so the bridge. This is basically what controls all the devices, a bit like that router in your typical IP-based network setup. So what I use is called a Conbee II. There's now the Conbee III, so don't go out and buy a Conbee II unless it's ridiculously cheap, albeit that is still pretty functional and I've been using it for years and I don't have an issue with it at the moment. The Conbee III, however, does support the latest Zigbee protocol and also some other competing standards, and it also uses the same chip that the new Home Assistant Sky device uses, so you can be sure that it's a quality device that's going to be well supported. Now, what does that actually do? Well, that's the bit that sends and receives signals on your Zigbee mesh network. Now, the way I have this set up is it comes as a USB stick that is plugged into my Proxmox Dell server. This is then hardware passed through to a VM that's running Docker, and I then spin up the Deconz application in Docker. That's what we're going to do at the end of this video. Now, that acts as a piece of middleware between the hardware and ultimately my Home Assistant. There's also an MQTT server, and we won't get onto that in this video, that will be in future videos. But that again is a signaling messaging protocol that we use quite frequently within home automation to send messages. I specifically use it within my Frigate setup. Again, you've seen my Frigate videos before, but all of that is baked into my home automation. So I can do things based upon whether the camera detects a person on the front. I can make my lights flash green, for example, or I can start recording. All of those sorts of things, and it's a lot smarter than your traditional setup whereby you might just have motion settings. I go into that more detail in my Frigate video, so please do go and check that out. So now that you understand how that's kind of cobbled together in terms of a networking topology, what devices do I have? Well, I mentioned before I've got my smart lights and I've got some smart switches, so I can click a button and the lights go out. I can double click it and they go back on. And because this is kind of a third-party device and it's open using the Zigbee protocol, it has a lot more flexibility than some of the locked down ecosystems. A bit analogous to like the Apple ecosystem, whereby you buy the product and it does what it says on the tin, and outside of that you're probably not going to get much flexibility. So with that also comes a few quirks, and home automation has been, I would say, somewhat rough over the years, but it is definitely maturing. That's because a lot of these devices are built to sort of the minimum price point, and you're kind of at the manufacturer's mercy as to how well they adhere to some of the common standards like the Zigbee protocol, and there are multiple versions of that, as I've said. Now, depending on your luck of the draw, you definitely want to go and check out and read reviews before you do that. Things like the Sonoff devices, which I've used outside of my Hue devices, have actually been pretty good. And in terms of how they support the standards, they're one of the better. However, like I said, my setup is a few years old now, so there might be some better players out there, and that's hence why I've said this series is going to be open-ended, because I want to get more into the home automation space and check out some of the more recent developments. Other things that I have are my Alexas, which operate as both speakers in my Home Assistant setup, so it can actually state things that are happening. So if I wanted to, I could have alerts, burglar alarms, those sorts of things. I have a Ring doorbell, which is also integrated into Home Assistant, so not directly on the Zigbee network. Those actually operate on Wi-Fi, but they're all plugged into what I coin my Home Assistant, which is my home automation, and I can do things off the back of that. One quick segue, you might notice that why do we have Wi-Fi enabled devices and why do we have Zigbee? Well, that's because Wi-Fi is pretty heavy. So you'll typically get that on things that are hard powered or things that can take bulky batteries, because it does use more power, and it's typically for devices that need it. So for example, a camera might need it on a Ring doorbell because it's recording footage, or at least it's having to send that in real time to a server somewhere. Most of the things like these switches, they're extremely low powered. They only need to send a signal when something happens, and the Zigbee network is specifically designed for that. Outside of that, like I said, the key thing that I use really are my thermostat, which is controlled as part of my home automation. and that's about it. There are a myriad of other things that people do in their home labs and in their homes, things like smart locks, etc. I'm not quite that brave yet and don't have the wife approval, and I'm not actually sure that I want to go down that route. So I will get onto those sorts of topics in the future, and we will look at those hardwares, but I don't actually use them myself. Outside of that, it's really the automation and the logic that I have in place, which I think is pretty decent, and I will be sharing that in future videos. But like I say, it's things like making sure that the heating comes on when one of my sensors throughout the house picks up that the temperature's too low. So in your traditional model, you may only have one thermostat. Now with a smart home, you could have sensors that are very cheap, very low powered in lots of different rooms, and you could tell it to turn on the heating when a room reaches a certain temperature. And if you really wanted to, there are actually smart thermostatic valves for radiators. So you could target just that room for that heating, which is pretty cool. I also have actually on the end of that, I have this here, which is a Raspberry Pi Pico plugged into a Pico Enviro board with a particulate sensor on the end. Yes, I am the devil reincarnated. I have a wood burner, and I was really keen to see how much particulate that actually puts into the room. Plus, it also does a ton of stuff like light, humidity, and temperature, which a lot of my other sensors do, and I'll be demonstrating in Home Assistant in a little while. So with that said, let's move on now to what this looks like and deploying the Deconz app. Now, this is an app created by the people that make the Conbee II, and you don't have to use this app. But like I say, this is tried and tested. I'm using this, but do note that there are things like Zigbee to MQTT, which tends to get a better feedback within the market, certainly within the home lab space, and that's something that I will be trying out in future videos. So whilst this might not be the best at the moment in terms of what's current and what's great, hopefully the process of what I'm talking to you about the hardware, the middleware, and then something to control all of this, i.e. things like Home Assistant, those are all applicable no matter what you choose. Now, I've remote connected to my Docker host, which is hosting my current implementation of Deconz, and this is the config that I'm running for my instance, and I'll be sharing this like all of my other videos on GitHub. I've connected to this through VS Code and can control the Docker environment as well, so do check that video out if you want to do this. So let's have a quick look, as always, at the Docker container and what's actually going on here. So as you can see, I'm using the Deconz app, and I'm being a bit naughty and using the latest rather than version pinning, but I don't have anything that's automatically going to update this for me like Watchtower, so I only run this when I need to, and I also take backups before I do it. Now, there's nothing really too exotic about this. The key things we need to look at are the ports. So what have we got here? Well, we've got 8002, 5443 and 5900. Now, the important thing here is you can choose whatever you want. So if you've got a port conflict here, you can change that. You can also specify, other than the 5900, these two here could be your 80 and 443 if you wanted to put this behind a traffic proxy. There's the clue. These are basically for access to the Phoscon Web GUI, so you actually get an interface for controlling your smart devices. I have this available, but I don't actually use it. That's because I integrate all of these devices through Home Assistant, which gives me a much nicer, cleaner, more powerful interface on both my web browser and also, probably more importantly, through my mobile phone. So what have we got here? Well, 8002, if you look down to the environment variables, is the web port. So if you put in your Docker IP and this port, it will go to that IP address, and I'll show that in a minute. 5443 is the WebSocket port, and 5900 is for VNC, which is basically a Linux version of the Windows Remote Desktop. So what this allows me to do is this actual Docker image is running a small GUI inside itself, and I can actually visualize to you my whole Zigbee network, which hopefully you'll find quite interesting. We'll get onto that shortly. Other things in here, the volumes. So this is basically just where the Deconz app is going to store all of your files. So these are configuration files, etc. And you can back this up within the application. This is just OTAU, over the air update. So my actual Conbee stick, that USB stick, you can actually update the firmware on that for new functionality, fixes, support, etc. Now, because this is using a pass-through device, i.e. that USB device into the VM and then being used by Docker, I need to specify a device. And by default, this is the only USB stick on that machine, that virtual machine. And so that will take the slot of ACM0. Do check what it is on your host if you're passing through more than one USB stick. And if you are, and if it's different, as you can see here highlighted, you can specify it in the environment variables with a different number. Now, the rest of these things are basically debug information for different settings. Do go and check, which I've linked in the description below, the documentation for Deconz if you're going to use this, and you can decide which debugs you want to have on and available to you. Other than that, I've set VNC mode to true, so that means I can actually connect to this through VNC, which I'll show you in a second. Again, you can change the port for VNC if you don't want 5900, set a password and set a region, and then I've just told it no new privileges, true, for security reasons. Now, if you deploy this, you're going to get the following thing available. So here I've downloaded VNC Viewer, which is a tool for connecting to this VNC instance. So as I said in the background, I've enabled VNC and this allows me to remote connect to it. So I can double click this because I've saved it, but all I've done in here is put in the Docker IP, which I'm sorry is very small, but here 200.50 and the port of 5900, and then put my password in. So I'm going to connect now. It's going to ask for my password. And now that I've connected, you get this. Again, apologies, I can't blow this up much more, but this is my Zigbee network with all of my devices. And it's a pretty cool graphic, which I really like. Like I say, there are competitors out there, the Zigbee to MQTT, which also has a similar interface, and we'll get onto that in later videos. But I just wanted to show you the theory more than anything. And this proves what I spoke about earlier in the video about the mesh network. So let's say, for example, this temperature and humidity sensor here. So this actual temperature and humidity sensor is a Philips Hue sensor, which I bought with my lights. And obviously it says what it does what it says on the tin. It measures temperature and humidity, but it also does motion as well. But if we follow this green line, apologies, it's not easy to see, you can see that it actually goes to the garage lamp, which is a lamp I have just to my right. And it's quite interesting because those three devices are all in a row, and it's connected based on proximity, i.e. signal strength. So what's actually happening here is you can see when the lights blink, that's when a message is being sent. This is actually sending updates to the garage lamp, and that garage lamp is acting as a repeater. And then this garage lamp, if I wiggle it, you can see how many things are connected to this. But ultimately, you can see at the bottom with this blue, the configuration tool 1. Not a very nice name, but that's my Conbee stick, that USB stick, which ultimately connects to everything, either with a direct hop or through another repeater. Now, the beauty of this is, because I'm in my garage, which is in the corner of my house is pretty old as well. It's got 1850s solid double bricks. So for some of the lights that are at the far end of the house, there simply isn't enough signal strength for it to go from the garage all the way to the other side of the house. And the beauty of that mesh network is, I have lights dotted around the house such that a signal can hop to a light, hop to another light, and then hop to a sensor if needed, and it maintains functionality and preserves that signal strength effectively. So commands can go from one side to the other, and it will keep trying to repeat that until the state is matched, which is pretty cool. So hopefully as well here, you can see that I get the battery status as well for all of my devices, so I know that when they need to be changed. And I've got some built-in logic in Home Assistant that ties all that together, so I get alerts, etc. when batteries need changing. So with this in place now, it allows me to click this light and it will send a signal throughout this mesh network to the corresponding light. So I've actually got this switch set up to operate multiple lights. So if we have a quick look now at the Phoscon app, and then we'll look at Home Assistant. So for the Phoscon app, I've actually just gone to my Docker IP with port 8002, which was specified. And if I click on this Conbee, this is an illustration of that one. This is the gateway. Here you can see all of my lights throughout the house, which were those ones that were showed in the VNC app. Some of these are turned off at the moment or broken, so if they're grayed out, don't worry about that. Also, I don't really manage it through here. I just use this application for the initial pairing with the Conbee. So if you wanted to pair something, you would simply click on here and then you go to the lights, and then you can add a new light by clicking that button and going through the pairing process for that light. But you can also see on the left, I've got switches and sensors for different things throughout the house, and their pairing process should hopefully be pretty simple. You can also see here the gateway. You can update the firmware for this device as well, and you can see the version I've got here is the Conbee II. Like I said, the Conbee III is available and far more capable, but if you just need something simple and you can get this for dirt cheap, then do go for it. It will teach you the basics. Now, as I said, I can actually turn off the lights and things in here by clicking and changing all the colors, etc. But I don't do that. I bring out the big guns and I use Home Assistant. So firing up Home Assistant, you can see it's far more attractive. And if I fire up my mobile device, there's actually a similarly nice interface for that that makes the whole thing really seamless. So what do I have here in Home Assistant? Well, all of the lights, and I can click on these and I can change the color and do things like that, depending on whether your light supports that, i.e. is it color light or just a white light. You can see light events here, so I know if the kids have sneaked down early in the night or on Christmas morning, etc. Or I know when the cat comes in, for example. I've also got the light level. This is pretty nerdy stuff. I don't know if you'd ever need to do that. Might be useful if you're doing things like cultivation in your house, you've got a greenhouse, etc. You could obviously put that in to know when the light levels are high. On top of that, I've also got a temperature sensor, so the various temperatures throughout the room, which I track as well. And I don't currently have this plugged in, the particulate sensor like I mentioned earlier, so this data isn't populated, but I will plug that in and I will get that populated within just a few seconds. Now, if I go into Home Assistant as well, you can see a lot of my automation here. So you can see when I press certain buttons and certain things happen. Here, for example, the doorbell rings, it will flash the garage lights. That's because I'm often on meetings in the day and I don't want my Alexa going ding dong, my phone, etc. But I still want a visual indicator that somebody's at the door. And similarly, I've got two lights in front of me, which you can't see. One of those will flash red if there's somebody detected at the back of the house, and one will be green if they're detected at the front of the house. And through this switch, there's multiple clicks and there's also holds, I can turn on or disable those automations, which is pretty cool if I'm the only one in the house and I know nobody's around, the kids are at school, etc. It's kind of like a pseudo burglar alarm. So thanks for watching the first in this new home automation series. Hopefully that gives you a whistle-stop tour of what home automation is. Definitely the very basics. There's a ton more stuff I haven't covered but will cover in future videos. In the next videos, I'm going to be talking more about sort of MQTT and how I use that for my frigate cameras. And we'll also get on to deploying Home Assistant, because this is kind of the glue that binds all of this stuff together. Once we've got all the foundations in place, I will move on to looking at more general tools, more general middlewares, and different hardware that you could put into your home lab, and some of the security recommendations that I think you should put in place when dealing with any of these IoT devices. Like I said, these devices are built to a minimum price. A lot of them are pretty bare bones, and we are starting to see now lots of manufacturers from nefarious states, bad actors, etc., putting some malware into these devices. So at a minimum, anything that's going to go onto a Wi-Fi network, you should probably spin up an IOT WLAN for that. And I've showed you how to do that in previous videos, especially if you're using things like OpenSense or Sophos XG. Anyway, I'm wandering off piece, and I wanted to keep this quite succinct around what I have and where this series is going to go. So do let me know as well what you guys are using. I know there's going to be loads of people out there that are way beyond what I have, and I'm really interested to get your recommendations and some of the hardware you think that I just need to check out. So do drop a comment below. Anyway, that's a wrap. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care, everybody.